On a calm, quiet evening in a small suburban neighborhood, an ordinary nightly walk transformed into an unforgettable tale of bravery and resilience. Meet Helen Carter, a 68-year-old grandmother who enjoys her peaceful evening strolls with her loyal companion, Ranger, a retired 9 officer with a decorated past. For years, Helen and Ranger had roamed the same streets, their bond growing stronger with every step they took together. But one night, under the flickering glow of a streetlight, danger lurked where it was least expected. What started as a routine walk turned into a high-stakes showdown when 3 men made a terrible mistake. They underestimated Helen and her protector. With intentions as dark as the shadowy streets, these men soon realized they were not just facing an elderly woman and her dog. They were up against a former police hero trained to neutralize threats and a grandmother who refused to back down. This is the story of courage, loyalty, and justice, how a retired 9 and a fearless woman stood together to teach their attackers a lesson they'll never forget. Stay with us as we unravel the extraordinary events of that unforgettable night. Helen Carter lived in a quiet, tucked-away neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The streets were lined with trees whose branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, and then the soft hum of crickets filled the air. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged warm smiles during the day, and the silence of the night felt like a comforting blanket. Every evening, around 10 p.m., Helen and her faithful companion Ranger embarked on their nightly walk. It was their cherished ritual, a moment of peace and reflection before the day came to a close. Ranger, a large and imposing German shepherd, was more than just a pet. He was Helen's protector and closest friend. With a muscular build, sharp eyes, and an unwavering loyalty, Ranger carried the weight of his past proudly. Before retiring to a quieter life with Helen, Ranger had been a decorated police 9. His years of service on the force had honed his instincts and courage. He was trained to face danger head-on with precision and control that few could match. Now, in his retirement, Ranger had found a new purpose, ensuring Helen's safety and companionship. That night began like any other, with Helen bundling up against the cool night air and Ranger by her side, his leash in hand. The pair walked along familiar streets illuminated by warm porch lights and faint street lamps. But as they rounded a corner, the serene atmosphere shifted. Under a flickering streetlight stood 3 men, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, their movements deliberate and uneasy. Helen felt a twinge of unease in her gut, a feeling she'd learned to trust over the years. Ranger sensed it too. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. One of the men noticed them approaching and nudged his companions, a smirk forming on his face. His mocking words carried across the still air. "Look at that, Grandma's out for a stroll with her big bad wolf." The other 2 laughed, their laughter sharp and unnerving, echoing in the quiet night. Helen tightened her grip on Ranger's leash, her heart beginning to race. She knew this wasn't just harmless teasing. The men's intentions felt darker, and their eyes carried a predatory glint. Ranger's growl grew louder, a clear warning. The night was no longer quiet. It was the prelude to an unforgettable confrontation. Helen Carter's heart pounded as she tightened her grip on Ranger's leash. The 3 men under the flickering streetlight had turned their attention to her, their smirks widening as they whispered among themselves. The tallest one, with a cocky swagger, took a step forward and called out, "Hey, Grandma, taking your wolf for a stroll? Don't worry, we won't bite, unless he does." His mocking tone was met with laughter from the other 2. Helen tried to steady her breathing, but the unease in her chest was hard to ignore. She'd seen enough in her 68 years to recognize trouble when it came her way. Her stomach churned, but her resolve solidified. This wasn't the time to show fear. Beside her, Ranger let out a low, menacing growl, his sharp eyes locked onto the men. "Relax, lady," the tall man continued, raising his hands in mock innocence. "We're just saying hello, no need for the guard dog act." His grin, however, told a different story. Helen could see the danger in his eyes, the kind that made her pulse quicken. The second man chimed in, his voice laced with cruelty. "Yeah, maybe she's training him to fetch her groceries." Their laughter echoed in the stillness. But Helen wasn't amused. She felt her legs trembling slightly, but she planted her feet firmly on the ground. She couldn't let them see her fear. It would only embolden them. Ranger took a step forward, his body tense, his growl growing deeper. The sound rumbled through the air like distant thunder, a warning that couldn't be ignored. The men's laughter faltered for a brief moment, but the tallest one shook his head and smirked. "What's this mutt gonna do, huh? Bark us to death?" he sneered, taking another step closer. Helen's voice came out steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, her tone firm. "Ranger doesn't back down. Neither do I." The third man, who had been silent until now, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, we'll see about that," he muttered. Ranger barked sharply, the sound cutting through the night like a knife. It wasn't the bark of an ordinary dog, it was commanding, precise, and filled with purpose. Helen had seen that side of him before, the side that had been trained for moments like this. The men seemed to hesitate, their confidence wavering for a split second. But then one of them pulled something metallic from his pocket. The faint glint of the streetlight revealed a blade, sharp and menacing. "Don't worry, Grandma," the man holding the knife said with a sinister grin. "This will be over before you even blink." Helen's breath hitched, but she refused to show weakness. Instead, she tightened her grip on the leash and braced herself. "Ranger," she whispered, her voice low and steady. The German shepherd seemed to understand her perfectly. His growl turned into a snarl, his fur standing on end. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Helen and the men. His body was tense, every muscle ready for action. The tall man reached out a hand, trying to test his luck. "Call off your dog, lady," or... Before he could finish, Ranger barked again, louder this time, and lunged forward, stopping just short of the man. Teeth bared, his growl vibrated through the air, daring them to come any closer. The man stumbled back, raising his hands defensively. "Okay, chill out, mutt," he stammered, but Ranger didn't back down. Helen stood her ground, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'd rethink your choices if I were you," she said, her gaze sharp and unyielding. The men exchanged uncertain glances, the bravado fading from their faces. They hadn't expected this, a woman with a fierce determination and a dog who clearly wasn't just a pet. As the tension thickened, Helen knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone in this fight. Ranger's instincts had kicked in, and together they were ready to face whatever came next. Helen barely had time to process the glint of the blade in the faint streetlight before the man with the knife took a step closer. His sinister grin was gone, replaced by a chilling determination. "Let's see how tough your dog really is," he snarled, raising the blade. "Big mistake," Helen muttered under her breath, her grip tightening on Ranger's leash. Before the man could take another step, Ranger moved like lightning. With a ferocious bark, he lunged forward, jaws locking onto the man's arm with precision. It wasn't a wild attack, it was calculated, the kind of move that spoke volumes about his years of training. The man let out a scream that shattered the still night as the knife clattered to the pavement. "Get this crazy dog off me," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The other two men froze for a moment, their bravado melting into wide-eyed fear. "What the heck is wrong with this dog?" one of them stammered, his voice trembling. Ranger wasn't letting go. He gave a sharp tug, pulling the man off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The metallic weapon lay forgotten as the man writhed, trying desperately to free himself from Ranger's iron grip. "Let him go, you mutt!" the tallest man shouted, snapping out of his shock. He grabbed a chunk of wood lying nearby and rushed forward. Helen stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding. "Ranger, watch out!" she yelled. But Ranger didn't need the warning. His sharp eyes caught the man's movement, and with agility that seemed impossible for a dog his size, he dodged the swing effortlessly. Releasing the first man's arm, he shifted his focus to the attacker with the wooden weapon. With a deep, guttural growl, Ranger lunged again, knocking the man backward. The force of the impact sent him sprawling onto the pavement with a loud thud. Okay, I get it," the man stammered, holding up his hands in surrender. The third man, still clutching a rusty metal pipe, hesitated. His confidence wavered as he looked between Ranger and his fallen companions. "This dog's not normal," he muttered, taking a step back. Meanwhile, Helen's senses sharpened as she noticed movement behind her. The third man had decided to try his luck by sneaking up on her. She felt a tug on her shoulder and turned just in time to see him reaching for her. Adrenaline surged through her veins. Without thinking, Helen gripped her handbag tightly and swung it with all her might. The bag connected with a satisfying thunk against the side of his head. Don't even think about it, she snapped, her voice fierce and unwavering. The man stumbled back, clutching his head and glaring at her. "What the heck, lady?" he shouted, more offended than hurt. "Serves you right," Helen shot back, gripping her bag like a weapon. Meanwhile, Ranger had disarmed the man with the wooden weapon and turned his attention to the last attacker. With a sharp bark, he lunged forward just enough to make the man drop the pipe in fear. "Are you kidding me?" the man shouted, his voice shaking as he backed away. Ranger wasn't letting up. He barked again, his movements precise and deliberate, forcing the man to stumble backward. With one final lunge, Ranger knocked him flat on his back, standing over him with teeth bared and a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Get him off me! Help!" the man wailed, his tough demeanor completely shattered. Helen stood tall, adrenaline coursing through her as she scanned the chaotic scene. One man was pinned under Ranger, another lay groaning on the ground, and the third clutched his head, clearly rethinking every decision that led him to this moment. "You messed with the wrong woman," Helen said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of pride and defiance. Ranger's protective instincts and her quick thinking had turned the tide. Together, they were an unstoppable team, and the attackers were learning that the hard way. As the chaos unfolded, the attackers began scrambling to regain their composure. The man pinned under Ranger thrashed on the ground, shouting, "Get this dog off me!" His voice cracked with desperation, but Ranger wasn't budging. His teeth were bared, his growl unwavering, a living wall of determination and strength. The second attacker, now weaponless, managed to stumble to his feet. His eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape route. "I'm out of here," he muttered, breaking into a sprint down the darkened street. Ranger's sharp ears perked up. Without hesitation, he took off like a missile, closing the gap in mere seconds. The man barely made it 10 steps before Ranger blocked his path, standing firm like an immovable force. The attacker skidded to a halt, his hands shooting into the air in surrender. Okay, I give up," he shouted, his voice trembling. Back at the scene, Helen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. "Hello, I need officers at Parkside Avenue," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "3 men tried to attack me, but my dog stopped them. They're still here." The operator's voice on the other end was calm. "Stay where you are, ma'am. Officers are on their way." Helen glanced at Ranger, who was now holding 2 of the attackers firmly in check. The third man, the tallest of the group, had finally scrambled to his feet. His eyes darted between Helen and Ranger, calculating his next move. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the ground. "Don't even think about it," Helen warned, her voice cold and sharp. But before he could act, Ranger turned his attention to him. The attacker froze, the confidence draining from his face as Ranger let out another fierce growl. The wood fell from his hands, clattering uselessly to the pavement. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew louder, their red and blue lights flashing against the buildings. The attackers exchanged panicked glances. "We're done for," one of them groaned, still pinned to the ground. Moments later, 2 patrol cars pulled up, the officers stepping out with purpose. One of them, a middle-aged man with a commanding presence, took in the scene with a mix of surprise and amusement. His eyes landed on Ranger, who stood guard over the attackers like a sentinel. "No way," the officer said, a smile spreading across his face. "Is that Ranger?" Helen blinked in surprise. "You know him?" she asked. The officer chuckled, crouching down to meet Ranger's gaze. "Know him? I worked with this guy back when he was on the force. Best canine we ever had, took down more suspects than half the precinct combined." The younger officer, clearly new to the force, stared at Ranger in awe. "Wait, this is the Ranger? The one from the training videos?" "That's the one," the older officer replied, shaking his head in disbelief. "Still a legend, I see." Meanwhile, the attackers were desperately trying to defend themselves. "We didn't mean any harm," one of them stammered, still lying on the ground. The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Right? And I suppose your buddy just happened to have a knife for fun?" He motioned toward the discarded blade. "It wasn't serious," the man protested. The younger officer pointed to a nearby security camera mounted on a street lamp. "Let's see what the footage has to say about that." As the officers cuffed the men and began loading them into the patrol cars, the older officer turned to Helen. "Ma'am, I have to say, you and Ranger handled yourselves better than most people would. If it weren't for the two of you, this could have ended a lot worse." Helen gave Ranger a pat on the head, her expression softening. "Well, I wasn't exactly alone, was I? He's the real hero here." The officer smiled, shaking his head. "He always has been. Even back in the day, Ranger had a knack for knowing exactly who the bad guys were. Guess some things never change." As the patrol cars drove off, Helen looked down at Ranger, his ears perked and his tail wagging slightly. "Good job, boy," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "Let's go home." Together, they turned toward the quiet streets, leaving behind the flashing lights and chaos of the night. But Helen knew one thing for sure: Ranger wasn't just her protector. He was her partner, and tonight he had proved once again that he was a hero through and through. The night's chaos ended with the attackers cuffed and taken away, their bravado shattered. Helen Carter and Ranger stood under the streetlight as the flashing red and blue of the patrol cars faded into the distance. The neighborhood had returned to its usual calm, but Helen knew life would feel different after this. By the next morning, word of the incident had spread like wildfire. Helen's phone buzzed endlessly with calls and messages from concerned neighbors, curious acquaintances, and even strangers who had heard the story. By noon, a local news van was parked outside her home, reporters eager to share the story of the courageous grandmother and her hero dog. Helen opened the door cautiously, Ranger sitting faithfully by her side, his ears perked and alert. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her. "Miss Carter, how does it feel knowing Ranger is being called a local hero?" one reporter asked. Another chimed in, "What do you want people to take away from this story?" Helen looked down at Ranger, who sat calmly as if he understood the attention was all for him. "Honestly," she began, adjusting her cardigan, "he's not just a hero, he's my partner. Last night wasn't just about stopping those men, it was about trust, bravery, and standing up for what's right. Ranger has always protected me, and I'm lucky to have him by my side." The crowd of reporters erupted into murmurs of admiration, their cameras capturing Ranger as he gave a soft wag of his tail, stoic as ever. As the day went on, neighbors stopped by to show their gratitude. Some brought dog treats, others left heartfelt thank you notes. One neighbor arrived with her young daughter, who shyly handed Helen a crayon drawing of Ranger wearing a superhero cape. "Thank you for keeping our neighborhood safe," the little girl said softly, reaching out to pet Ranger. The German shepherd leaned down, nuzzling her hand gently, earning a giggle from the child. Helen's heart swelled with pride. Throughout the day, packages continued to arrive: chew toys, gourmet dog biscuits, and even a shiny new collar with the words "Ranger the Brave" engraved on the tag. Helen chuckled as she held up the collar. "Well, Ranger," she said, "looks like you're famous now." Despite all the attention, Helen found herself reflecting quietly as the evening approached. She sipped her tea on the porch, Ranger lying at her feet, his ears twitching with the sounds of the neighborhood. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. She thought about the attackers and the lesson they were forced to learn. "They picked the wrong woman to mess with," she murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears. But it wasn't just about teaching a lesson. It was a reminder of the bond she shared with Ranger. He wasn't just her protector. He was her companion, her partner in life's unpredictable moments. The outpouring of support from her community reminded Helen that courage wasn't just about facing danger head-on. It was about trust, the trust she had in Ranger and the trust her neighbors now had in them both. As the sun set, Helen and Ranger went out for their usual evening walk. This time, as they passed neighbors' homes, people waved and called out greetings. A few children ran up to pet Ranger, calling him Superdog and the Legend. Helen smiled, feeling a sense of pride and connection she hadn't felt in a long time. Turning the corner where it all happened, Helen noticed something new: a small plaque mounted on a post. It read, "Here, Ranger the hero dog protected his owner, Helen Carter, with bravery and loyalty." She crouched down beside Ranger, running her fingers over the inscription. "Well, look at that, buddy," she said with a smile. "You've got your own plaque now. Guess you're officially a big deal." Ranger sniffed the air, wagging his tail slightly as if to say, "I've always been a big deal." For Helen, life had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the events of that night left a lasting impact. It wasn't just about courage or fame, it was about loyalty, trust, and the power of standing together in the face of adversity. As they walked back home, Helen couldn't help but feel grateful for the bond they shared. Ranger wasn't just a hero, he was family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Helen Carter sat on her porch, a steaming cup of tea in hand and Ranger resting at her feet. The events of the past few days had settled into a memory that felt almost surreal, a stark reminder of the strength that courage and loyalty could bring in moments of uncertainty. "For a night," Helen murmured, reaching down to stroke Ranger's fur. He looked up at her with his wise, watchful eyes, the same eyes that had faced danger head-on without a hint of hesitation. Ranger wasn't just a retired police dog or a protector, he was a partner, a quiet but steadfast reminder of what it meant to stand for what's right. The story of that evening wasn't just about bravery. It was a testament to the unshakable bond between a woman and her loyal companion. In the face of danger, Helen and Ranger had proven that strength doesn't always come from size or age. It comes from the heart. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. Helen had felt fear that night. Her heart had raced, her hands had trembled, but she had stood her ground, trusting in Ranger and in herself. Together they had turned a moment of vulnerability into one of triumph. Ranger's actions reminded Helen and everyone who heard their story that heroes can come in the most unexpected forms. Whether it's a retired 9 with years of training or a grandmother wielding a handbag, bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about protecting what matters and standing up when it counts. The aftermath of that night brought not only relief, but also a sense of pride for Helen. The gratitude from neighbors, the media coverage, and even the plaque honoring Ranger all spoke to a deeper truth. Kindness and justice always prevail. The attackers had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of their actions, and the community had rallied around Helen and Ranger, proving that unity and support can shine even in the darkest moments. As Helen gazed out into the quiet street, she reflected on the themes of her story: courage, loyalty, and trust. These weren't just abstract ideas, they were living, breathing forces that had carried her and Ranger through that night. She looked down at her faithful companion and smiled. "You know, Ranger," she said softly, "you showed everyone that being a hero isn't about wearing a cape or carrying a badge. It's about protecting the ones you care about and standing up for what's right, no matter what." Ranger wagged his tail slightly, his calm demeanor suggesting he understood every word. Helen hoped their story would inspire others to face challenges with courage and to lean on the bonds that truly matter. Life is unpredictable, often throwing the unexpected in our path. But with loyalty, bravery, and trust, even the toughest moments can be overcome. As the stars began to twinkle above, Helen turned to Ranger. "Come on, buddy, let's head inside." They walked through the door together, a team that had faced the odds and come out stronger for it. Their story wasn't just about a single night. It was about the enduring power of trust, the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, and the lesson that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. So, let this be a reminder to us all. Bravery isn't reserved for the fearless, and kindness isn't just for the soft-hearted. Together, they can make a difference in ways we might never expect. In the end, the world needs more people and dogs like Ranger and Helen, because when courage meets loyalty and justice is backed by determination, there's no challenge too great to overcome. And as Helen would say with a twinkle in her eye and a smile on her face, kindness and justice always prevail.